The Liberals gain another MP, this time from the NDP, putting Prime Minister Mark Carney just 2 seats away from a majority. And he'll have a chance to nab that majority next month in 3 by-elections. Nunavut MP Lori Idlout is now the 4th MP in 4 months to cross the floor to the Liberals.
It is a great pleasure. One of Canada's greatest constituency MPs. You represent a riding that is the size of Mexico, and very down to earth. And we've had conversations about what we can do, both large and small, in Nunavut.
Like with any complicated issue, it wasn't just one thing that happened. There are a variety of many things that have allowed me to really reflect on this, and I'm very thankful to be so warmly welcomed.
Of course, opposition MPs are not welcoming the news.
To us, the decision of voters at the ballot box is a sacred trust. And if a member of Parliament wants to override that decision, we believe they must go back to the voters and make that case to them and receive a renewed mandate.
When I went door knocking in my riding in the South Kelowna area, people said that they felt that members of Parliament should not, especially just after running in an election for one team, suddenly switch and reverse all their principles. So the member of Parliament needs to speak to her constituents in regards to that.
You know, trust is a big thing with any voter, but especially in Nunavut. And so to see somebody that has been decrying on food costs and affordability and all those issues for this government that's been in power now for the last 10 years, and now all of a sudden to join that caucus, that's difficult for a lot of people to swallow.
Time now for the Power Panel. Sherelle Evelyn is the managing editor of The Hill Times. Michelle Cadario was deputy chief of staff to former Prime Minister Paul Martin. Tim Powers has worked as a strategist for Conservative parties. And Jordan Lightness is a former NDP strategist. Welcome, everyone. Jordan, I'm going to start with your reaction to this latest crossing from an NDP MP.
Yeah, I think for sure a tough day for the party, and a lot of the people I talked to have expressed a sense of disappointment and betrayal, but almost nobody expressed any surprise. So I think that, we heard, of course, public reports about whether Lori might consider crossing in December. So it was well known that there were conversations ongoing, and I think that there was a sense, maybe a bit of an air of inevitability around it. That doesn't make it any easier for the NDP because, of course, now their caucus, which was already historically small, is shrinking again. So it puts them in a really challenging position, especially as they're in the process of selecting a new leader. So this new leader is now going to inherit a considerably smaller caucus.
Now, Tim, very different from when there were rumors about Conservatives, particular Conservatives. When Chris D'Entremont got rumored that, well, he had to make a decision right then, go or stay. But with the NDP, it was rumored, but no one was pushing her out to make a choice. And we got to this point yesterday or last night. What do you make of that difference?
Well, I guess this is what happens when you endorse Avi Lewis for leader of the NDP. I may have stolen that line from somebody. I'm not telling you who or if they're in this room. But I will say this, look. I mean, Karina, I have to laugh at the whinging and the whining, right? I get why it happens. Michelle and I understand this. Jordan understands. When you lose somebody, it sucks. But honest to God, get over it. Both in the NDP and the Conservatives. The bigger issue, if you're the Conservatives or the NDP, is, all right, one, is this going to continue to happen? And if it is, as it continues to happen, why is it happening? The harping on them, the crapping on them, that's not going to stop it. The intimidation that some have alleged is not going to stop it. What's going to stop it? That's the thing you should be looking at. Floor crossing has happened as long as there have been democracies. And it's great today the NDP gets the spotlight on itself because of floor crossing, not their leadership race. Probably not the way they wanted to earn it. Yeah, it's a bit different than the Conservatives, but I think that speaks to why maybe people find Carney appealing and why they want to go there. He's taking an approach that is unique to each individual case. Some apparently want titles. Others simply want to move over and get funding in their riding. You can call that what you want to call that. Ultimately, the voters will decide what they think of it.
Michelle, what does this say about the state of the NDP, and does it need to do some pretty deep soul searching, or is this just par for the course right now for today's NDP?
Well, I think as Jordan referenced, it's a rough day and a rough year that they've been having, and it's certainly not probably what a new leader for the NDP wants to come in on. But I think this says, quite honestly, less about the NDP and much more about Mark Carney and the Prime Minister that he is, and the fact that he is, really breaking the mold and building a new coalition of people. His lack of partisanship himself, I think, is making him appealing. He's got a very much a focus on building the economy. The North, is particularly important to him, not just in the context of defense, but in terms of where he's from. And so, I think that, it's understandable that the MP from Nunavut would be interested in that, given the unprecedented level of investment that's starting to go on out there. But, you're seeing that right across the country. He is getting things done. He's getting projects moving. There's a bit of an energy both about him and about his agenda. And so, I think that it's kind of demonstrated in some of the polling right now, and I hate, resting everything on polling, but it seems that Canadians are also behind him. So, it's not surprising that people are looking across the floor and saying, I kind of like that guy. He's a good leader. He's a great Prime Minister. I want to be part of his team.
Sherelle, when there's floor crossing, obviously they're going to something, but they're also leaving something behind. For both the NDP and the Conservatives, going to what Tim was saying, if you can't do anything about the other guy across the way, how do you shore up your own ranks and attractiveness to not have to stem the bleeding, basically?
Yeah, I do think that's interesting because I don't know if today's news, if Idlout's crossing really says anything about the NDP leadership race in particular, but I know that the optics aren't great because you're looking at people could take the position that, well, the people who are in the race, they aren't enticing enough for the people who are already in the party to stay. But given the specifics of Lori Idlout, given the specifics of Nunavut, given the specifics of Nunavut politics, and all of those things, I don't know if those are linear conclusions to draw. But it does, of course, make you have to think, okay, like Tim said, what do we have to do to make sure that people find us attractive? And I don't know if right now anybody has really narrowed in on how do we get away from the Carney effect. Carney right now is offering that stability. People don't want to go to an election, et cetera, et cetera. That's only going to last for so long. So in this rebuilding period, parties do have to think about what do we do to get away from that? Because without the NDP, without a strong NDP, you get that shift towards the right. A lot of the people will say that, the things that the Liberal Party accomplished, that a lot of NDP voters were able to kind of, if they were holding their nose and voting for the Liberals in the last election, that was due to the supply and confidence agreements, things like pharmacare, that the NDP was able to push the Liberals on. So without that, we're going to drift further into that centrist right space. And so those progressive voices in the Liberal Party as well are going to have to think about how are we going to have our voices heard so that everything doesn't get swallowed up and it becomes the party of one.
And I guess, Jordan, the NDP has to figure out how to start getting credit for some of the things that it does. But
harder than it sounds.
Yeah. What I wanted to ask you, though, was what you make of the interim leader, Don Davies, getting out ahead of Idlout's own statement. I mean, putting out that's how we all learned about it, was the statement from the NDP that she was leaving, not from her. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's pretty good crisis communication because actually they scooped the announcement. So they were the first ones out, and that they were able then to kind of frame it the way they wanted to frame it. And it's interesting because we've seen this, the case as well with other floor crossers. When Chris d'Entremont crossed, news got out, of course, before the government was able to make it public themselves. So there's, something obviously happening in those conversations where it's maybe not as tight as the government might wish it to be. But I just wanted to come back on a point that Sherelle made, because I think it is really important. Politics in the North, particularly in Nunavut and the Northwest Territories, is very different from politics in the South. It's much more nonpartisan, and in fact, at the territorial level. There are no political parties there. So I think that understanding the floor crossing in that context, it's going to be different than when we see it in the South. There is just a lot more movement and nonpartisan political space in the North more generally. And so I think Ms. Idlout really saw herself as part of that as well right from the beginning. She has always been, when she was in the NDP caucus, quite a vociferous critic of the government. She pressed the government very hard on investment for the North and for Nunavut. So it'll be interesting to see how that voice is able to still be heard in a much larger Liberal caucus, where she'll be one voice among a much bigger crowd.
Tim, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre posted on social media, and I think we have a copy of it or a graphic of it, saying that Mark Carney is using backroom deals to seize a costly majority that voters rejected. How could a weakened NDP impact the Conservatives?
Well, when the Conservatives have won elections, the most recent elections that Conservatives won, particularly the majority in 2011 that Stephen Harper won, who was in opposition? The NDP. A stronger NDP helps the Conservatives. I think the math over the last 20-odd years has shown that. So if the NDP remains weak and are below 10 percentage points, that's a problem for the Conservatives. I mean, we go back, Karina, to the 2025 campaign and everything leading into it. I think Conservatives now are basically acknowledging, look, we went too hard after Mr. Singh. We kneecapped Mr. Singh at that time and linked him too closely to the Liberals, and that in the end, among other circumstances, helped Prime Minister Carney become Prime Minister Carney. So the Conservatives need the NDP to be stronger, thus why they're going after Mark Carney here and not the NDP and saying, oh, look, the NDP are weaker and they're more inefficient. That's precisely why Pierre Poilievre is saying what he's saying. And it also plays to an audience that he has who still are parliamentary purists, but, forget things like David Emerson and Leona Alislav and others who have crossed the floor because, again, it's a political reality.
So the lesson learned about not going after an enemy who actually, in some political aspects, is an ally.
An enemy who's a frenemy, in this case.
Exactly. Michelle, four floor crossers in a very short period of time. I don't know that we know whether this is a record or not, but what, in terms of the morale of the House, does it do to the morale of the House?
Well, it depends what side of the aisle you're on. When I was in Paul Martin's government and we got some floor crossers, it was rejuvenating. It meant our life was extended as a government, and I suspect that the Liberals are feeling quite good about this today, and I think that they're also feeling that the agenda that they have and how they're connecting with Canadians must be working if the opposition are looking. If some of the opposition are looking to move over. I'm not sure that Pierre Poilievre is doing himself any favors by trying to, suggest that this is about backroom deals or anything like that. Because, think about Canadians. A lot of people have changed their minds since the election. Certainly, polls, again, would say Mark Carney is even more popular today than he was during the last election. That would mean that some Canadians have also changed their minds about him. And come to see that he is the leader that he is. So in some ways, Pierre, instead of, I think Tim referenced this, maybe self-reflecting about why people are leaving his own caucus and why he's having trouble holding his people together, that he should kind of, take a little bit of a self-reflection point rather than trying to project some kind of a ridiculous smear on the Prime Minister. I don't think it serves him well, to be quite honest with you at all.
Sherelle, we have talked about what drives people, well, not necessarily drives people, but what makes it easier for them to leave their party and cross the floor. And Michelle talked earlier about why she thinks Mark Carney is attractive or his government is attractive. What do you think is attracting this many floor crossers over, when I think arguably you could say the honeymoon period for Mark Carney is over? Now we're in the real thing, and he's still high in the polls and attracting floor crossers. Yeah,
well, I wonder if it's kind of that snake eating its tail thing. The as Carney becomes more attractive, the polling gets better and better, and people cross over. And as people see people crossing over, they start looking at the Carney government, and the polling gets better and better. So I'm not sure what exactly it is, but I do think that the fact that there is a now former NDP MP that has joined the caucus, it does shift the conversation a little, because before, when it was Conservatives who were crossing the floor, it was easier to say, well, Carney is occupying that progressive conservative center-right space, so that's easier for people on that side to cross. But now when you have somebody from the NDP, you can make the argument, okay, well, this is an attractive plan, government, etc., for lots of people and not just of one particular political ideology. So I don't know. The fact that there is this ongoing, the threat from the United States hasn't abated, the really well-received international profile that Carney is generating, all of those things are potentially giving people the feeling that, okay, well, maybe this isn't something that's going to taper off. And if we want to get in on what he's doing, now's the time.
Michelle, we've talked a lot on this show and on the news about what would change and why, of course, it's pretty obvious why Mark Carney would want a majority. If he gets a majority, what would change for him? We understand that. But what are like the top two things you think would change most and be the kind of change that he would most appreciate out of getting a majority if he gets one through the by-elections?
Well, first, it's going to be a very slim majority, so it's not that much different from the slim minority. So I don't think a whole lot's going to change, except for committees. So once committees are reconstituted, then the numbers there all kind of lean and reflect the House count, and so that would be a major one. I don't want to count our chickens. Liberals still have to win those by-elections. And I'll also point out that one of our candidates, I believe, was also a former NDP provincial MLA or provincial MPP in Ontario, who has also joined us quite recently.
Yeah, that's in Scarborough Southwest.
Pardon me?
You mean in Scarborough Southwest?
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. So she might be another member of Parliament who is obviously used to have NDP stripes, who's very comfortable with the Mark Carney caucus. But again, with everything so close, you still have to put up a speaker as well. It's still razor tight. The whips are still going to be super important, and pairing becomes very, very key if you're traveling. So.
Well, as you said, no one wants to count their chickens, I guess. With the defection that we've seen, and then with these by-elections coming up, they are 2 seats away from a majority. And they'll have a chance to secure that majority next month when voters go to the polls in 3 federal ridings. And we've just sort of talked a little bit about those. Those by-elections will be held on Monday, April 13th. As we've just been saying, 2 in the Toronto area, both considered Liberal strongholds, and 1 in Montreal, which the Liberals won over the Bloc Québécois last year by a single vote. Last month, the Supreme Court ordered a redo after some mail-in ballot issues were reported. Even if the Liberals get a majority, it won't exactly be a stable one. Here's the founder of Abacus Data, David Coletto.
It's probably still too close for comfort if you're the Prime Minister and you want to make sure you've got the ability to, move pieces of legislation quickly or not worry about a member of your caucus getting ill or not being in the House or not being able to connect to vote because they can do it virtually. It means it's still not ideal, but it's certainly much better than a minority because now they'll have control of the committees. And that is something underappreciated in terms of the ability to move legislation forward without a lot of friction.
Jordan, the NDP is now down to 6 MPs, one of whom is Quebec MP Alexandre Boulerice, who has openly said that he's pondering a jump to provincial politics. What does the party need to do to stem the bleeding?
Yeah, well, the first thing, of course, for the party is that invisibility is death. And so they need to find a way to break through and show some presence, not just here in Ottawa, but across the country, to remind Canadians that they're there as the voice of progressives. There is a huge swath of Canadians who would put themselves on the left side of the spectrum, many of whom I think have, while they may right now be parking their support with Mark Carney, don't love everything that's happening, and also don't love the things that are not happening when it comes to, for example, things like housing or climate action or any of the other domestic files that haven't gotten the same attention that we've seen the Prime Minister put on things like trade and economic development. So there are whole aspects of the Canadian picture here that are not really being dealt with. And the NDP has absolutely a huge role to play in bringing those voices to Parliament. But they have to remind Canadians they're out there. They have to remind them what they're fighting for, who they're fighting for, and really do the work of rebuilding the party through connections at the regional level. The NDP is having a very rough time federally right now. I don't think anyone's denying that. But they are in government or in official opposition in 6 provinces across the country. So there are strong structures to build on, and they're very competitive in a lot of places that matter electorally. So I think we'll see the new leader, regardless of who it is, coming in and trying to do some of that work to really make an impression on those Canadians who might be more inclined to move away from Mr. Carney as time goes on, and to remind them that the New Democrats are there and that they're fighting for the issues that matter to them.
Tim, your take, is it far too soon to count any political party, especially the NDP, out?
History's shown us that. I mean, 93, I heard David McLaughlin reference that earlier to you. Both the PCs and the NDP were in very, very, very awful positions. The PCs, of course, disappeared but became part of the Conservative Party. Though the Liberals have done exceptionally well, Karina, at ruling Canada for a long time in terms of political wins, people's minds do change. For the Conservatives, they have been wanting time. Now they effectively have time. They're going to have a bit more time, and they should use that time wisely. How do they come at Carney? Because at some point, Trump is either going to be weakened because of the midterms, and as time goes by, he'll become less appealing. How do they find their way in there? And what do they do to do that? How do they use what I would say was a pretty successful trip for Pierre Poilievre overseas and build more things like that show him in a light that maybe helps mute some of the negatives that he has there. The challenge for the Conservatives is not to practice as they did last time, just hoping that, oh God, nobody ever gets a 4th majority. Well, I hope the strategy is, oh God, nobody ever gets a 5th majority. I don't think they're thinking that way. I think Stephen Outhouse, the campaign manager, is well past thinking that way. But I think use time to your advantage. Use time to your advantage. Try things, test things, and build it accordingly, because a lot of the economic agenda you should be pretty happy with, because a lot of it is co-opting from you. You're not going to get political credit for it, but you can find ways to build the next agenda you can get credit for when you're in government.
Yeah, sort of like the NDP not getting credit for dental care.
Exactly.
Farm care. Yeah. Cheryl Idlout won her riding by a narrow margin. I think we have a graphic of that, separated from the Liberal candidate by less than 50 votes. There we are. Could that have been a factor in Idlout's decision?
I mean, possibly, but from the things that I've seen from her and read from her even today, it does sound more as though she's concerned about how can she best advocate for her constituents. And as we covered earlier, the politics in the North and in Nunavut are a little different. They're less partisan. Yes, obviously, when you have a really tight vote and you're thinking, okay, well, if we had to go again, would people be open to voting Liberal? You can't imagine that's not a consideration. But at the same time, there was not going to be, as far as we know, we don't know, but it doesn't seem as though there's going to be a general election in the offing in the next few weeks. So if she wanted to hang on and continue to push from the outside, I think she could have done so. So I don't know if it was that so much, but I do think that the considerations now within the House are going to be really interesting to watch, simply because you'll have these by-elections, and as Jordan said, Lori Idlout was a strong voice. So those types of voices could potentially hold more weight as the dynamics of the House and the demographics of the House continue to shift back and forth between minority and majority territory, because as people want things, as people push for things, eventually the Prime Minister is going to have to start listening and cooperating with some of those voices, because they will start to hold power even from within his own party.
Michelle, we talked about the by-elections, and obviously we've talked about how two are fairly safe Liberal strongholds. One is not. It's Terrebonne. That's the one we were all paying attention to and still paying attention to. I'm wondering how Idlout's crossing impacts the stakes in Terrebonne.
I'm not sure it does, actually. I think that, Terrebonne is a different riding. It's really Liberals versus Bloc Québécois. And I think that there's.
But let me clarify that maybe it's. I guess what I'm asking is, now that it's quite clear to people that they could get their majority through the two safe Liberal seats, Terrebonne is not make it or break it for a majority. Does that change the motivation of voters, whether Bloc or Liberal, in the riding? Because now we know what the outcome is in terms of a majority or not?
I'd be surprised if it does, to be honest. I don't think that there was ever any plans for the candidate there to be campaigning on, if you vote for me in, we get a majority, because I don't think that that's great politics. I think this is about having someone who is in government and somebody who can contribute to the caucus, who has the ear of the Prime Minister, and who's going to be there to get things done. I think that. Probably showing that the coalition that Mark Carney is drawing from, that he's appealing to, is broader, and that NDP supporters are certainly taking an interest and clearly taking action to do that. Is great for the bona fides as well. But I don't think that any voter is going to go into the ballot box aware that this is going to make them one up or one down, and all of a sudden they're going to get control of the committees. I just don't believe that they vote that way, or that anybody really votes that way. And so I think that it's going to be much more likely on national issues, and very much about Mark Carney, and if he is kind of connecting with Quebec the same way that we're seeing throughout the rest of Canada.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you all. Cheryl Evelyn, Jordan Likeness, Tim Powers, and Michelle Cadario.